she gave birth to the last of her 9 children, our mother was 32 years old. Our father had managed to purchase the house from kind Mr. Bolenbaugh, who held the contract. The farmland he leased might have supported us adequately, had there not been so many of us. There were times we didn't have 50 cents for each of us to attend the high school football games, which meant that none of us would be able to attend. Our mother would do her best to find a way, so it didn't happen all the time. Her sacrifices were extraordinary. I can't recall a time when I witnessed her purchasing anything for herself. I'm sure her clothes were used. She always put our needs first. Her only self-indulgence became food, and she began to pack on the pounds. It was sometimes embarrassing for us, especially the big kids. Just the fact that there were so many of us was shameful to me. We all grew up with farm animals and knew how babies were made, but the barnyard version of procreation was the extent of our knowledge regarding such things. I dearly loved the babies. Each of them were proof for all the world to see that our parents had done the shameful deed 9 times, while respectable parents only did it 2 or 3 times. I was disgusted with them and could not understand the why of this. Well, to ignore the fact that 9 children was a burden too heavy for either of them to effectively manage, given their circumstances. As we grew older, the stress of Christmas for our mother became apparent to us. It was vital to her that we each had something we wanted under the tree, and she was so grateful when her grandmother, who regularly came to visit, would graciously send what she could spare for gifts. The check always came with a letter asking our mother to get something for herself, which to our knowledge she never did. Once we were old enough to work, we siblings would get her something that she would love, no matter how lame it was. Our great-grandma Kelly visited frequently, and we loved her visits. She was always cheerful, and looking back, it becomes apparent that her presence was a great comfort to our mother. Our Grandma Gates regularly organized family reunions at her house. We could keep track of our aunts and uncles and cousins, but our grandmother's siblings were quite another matter. They were always engaging us, but I never was quite sure exactly who I was talking to, or who the offspring they referenced were. We all grew up familiar with enormous family gatherings. When I became a teenager, I was allowed to stay with my Grandma Gates for a week or 2 during most summers, and I reveled in the peace of it. I think she knew how much I needed the respite. A few times her sister Nin, who was quite proud of her shapely, slender calves, visited, never failing to show off those legs. At that time, she and her sisters only wore dresses that hung about mid-calf, so she would lift the dress a little for me to see. There was plenty of good-natured ribbing over the fact that Aunt Nin could never seem to close the cupboard door, while Grandma was constantly having to remedy the problem. Grandma would instigate a game of rummy every day, and sometimes she would participate in charitable efforts at the church with her friend Mrs. Pilcher. Though they had known each other for years, their greeting was always formal.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Pilcher.
Good to see you, Mrs. Gates.
All of that politeness did not mean that there was no gossiping going on. I once caught Grandma at her living room window spying on the neighbors. She laughed and admitted to just being nosy. Our dad's sister Nell lived in Ohio and wasn't always able to manage attendance for all of those gatherings at our grandmother's house. It was a treat one summer when our Ohio cousins, who knew nothing of farm life, showed up. Our cousin Pam was too young, but Bob, Sue, and Kevin came home with us for a few days. They were mesmerized with the dogs, cats, chicken, cows, and pigs, egg gathering and barnyard smells, and room to run. It was a really new experience for them. Our father had built 2 unfinished bedrooms onto the back of the house where the barnyard fence contained the animals. Once, when we were playing in the back room, one of the cows stuck her head through the open window and began bawling. Our cousins were climbing over us to get out of that room as we just laughed. They never forgot it, and we still have a laugh over it once in a while. Our father's family would sometimes drop in unannounced if they were in the area. Uncle B took special care to make sure he spent time with all of his siblings. He worked as a lineman for the power company and lived in a small travel trailer which he pulled behind a very nice newer model car. Before the Cadillac became his favorite, it was the Ford Thunderbird. His need for a nice automobile was something passed down to him by his grandfather, Willie J. Vance. Uncle B would always have at least a couple of quarters for each of us kids, and I know his visits meant a lot to both of our parents. Once he arrived while our dad was involved in something at the farm, and our mother asked if she could speak to him privately in his trailer. For some particular reason, it resonated as uncomfortably odd for me, because our mother rarely exercised conversational filters. I would wonder if maybe she was asking him for financial help, which was something that would be outside the range of meeting our father's approval. It was Aunt Bernadine and our cousins Bill, Karen, and Irene that we saw the most of. Bernadine and our mother had become close. Bernadine may have been the only person other than our grandmother who could make our mother feel comfortable in her own skin. They could share confidences free of judgments that they may not have been able to share with anyone else. Though Bernadine lived 50 miles away in Bend, they regularly visited, and they would go to Hood River together each summer to buy fresh fruit for canning, sometimes canning together in our messy kitchen. Bernadine was tidy, but our mother was not. Together, they would occasionally take us to Grandma Gates's house, stopping at Detroit Lake on the way home for a refreshing swim session. Sometimes we'd even stop and get ice cream cones at the ice cream stand in Gates, Oregon. Karen and I would stay a few days at Grandma's to earn some money picking strawberries. Once, Irene stayed with us, which was not typical due to her extreme allergies. On that occasion, the three of us participated in a mud fight that took place in the strawberry field after a rain. It was the only time I can remember Grandma getting cross with us. She wouldn't let us in the house until we hosed ourselves off and made it clear we were never to come home again like that. Karen was really good at smoothing things over with hugs and a giant show of affection. Irene and I just watched with a little envy as that occurred. It was Grandma who washed our clothes in the end. Our mothers had much in common. Both were beautiful, both had begun to gain too much weight, both had experienced disappointing partner relationships, and both interpreted the Gates family concerns regarding their health and well-being as unfair and malicious judgments. While they laughed and enjoyed each other's company, whether spoken or not, they also both had experienced the dark side of a mental institution. If they ever spoke of that with anyone, it would have been to one another. None of us kids had any idea of such things. Bernadine's first marriage to George Wright, the children's father, had been a huge financial struggle. While George's family owned a successful business, he was unable to keep a job, and at one point the little family was living in a room above a garage, using the garage bathroom as the only source of water. Bernadine had repeatedly called her parents for a rescue, which did not include her husband, until one day our grandfather Frank told her,
"If you go back to him this time, I'm not coming to get you again."
Ending the marriage with George did nothing to enhance her mental stability. She was seriously ill, more so than our mother. We kids had no way of knowing that the threat of self-harm was all too often the only relief Bernadine could manage. It was Saturday, September 30th, 1967. I was babysitting when my mother showed up with my friend May Woodbury, which was so strange. She had brought May to take my place as the babysitter. She was distraught, but surprisingly calm when she told me that I would need to come home because Aunt Bernadine had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It made no sense, and in my mind, I knew it was a mistake, even though our mother never doubted. She loved her children too much, and she was always laughing. Her laugh was infectious and what I remember most about her. The notion may have come from our mother that Bernadine had felt responsible for her brother Shorty's tragic death, and I incorrectly assumed she'd been with him that night. In truth, she had been with her friends that night, letting the air out of the tires that were on the town doctor's car. That fact would have made no difference for Shorty, but it apparently had huge repercussions for Bernadine, who loved her brother so dearly and was already beginning to show signs of emotional and mental frailty. True to his nature, Uncle B paid for the funeral. Our mother offered me the choice to go or not, which was a relief as I didn't think I could handle it. Shortly afterwards, without my siblings and I ever seeing them, our cousins were suddenly sent to live with a father they did not know in California. Fortunately, George Wright had gotten himself together and was living productively with his wife. And when inquisitive Irene was old enough to ask, he shared with her that he had wanted custody and was told, in light of her illness, he had a good chance of obtaining it. But he backed off when Bernadine's physician had told him she would not survive without her children. It was almost 10 years before I would see my cousins again, and another 10 before Irene confirmed that she knew her mother had indeed taken her own life. Only then could I concede that she had done it. She had told her sisters that once and for all she'd figured out how to do it successfully, only to make a joke of that when they admonished her for saying such a thing. It was far from her first attempt. I can't imagine what my grandmother was enduring bearing a second child way before their time, with the added pain of social stigma. I'm sure, though the social consequences would not have mattered to her, it was no easier for our mother. She had friends, but I doubt any of them were as close as Bernadine, with whom she could easily share both the dark and light of who she was. Irene and I still sometimes talk about our mothers, something we uniquely share with one another. She said something once that haunts me a little.
Isn't it interesting that two people can suffer from the same thing? One survives, and one doesn't.
It made me wonder if our parents had ever tried to harm themselves when they were in their darkest moments. And I suddenly understood for myself and my siblings that though our mother was troubled and often difficult, unlike Irene, who learned to conquer everything that came her way, we would have each been less without her. Every spring at Culver High School, a mother-daughter tea was held, and a vote among the girls would determine which mother would be that year's Mother of the Year. I was long past high school when our mother was chosen for the honor. Those girls obviously didn't know everything, but it was a good choice. I don't know people who could have walked 5 minutes in my mother's shoes with demons constantly at her heels. The proof, as they say, is in the pudding, and when I look at our family today, I have to say, the pudding turned out to be pretty darn good. As a friend once said, she raised 9 kids and not a bum in the bunch, and if I do say so myself, it's a pretty entertaining bunch to hang out with. Just as she had colored the pages in the Scalawags of Oz when she was a child, she had colored us with a broad palette that covered the colors from dark and somber to light and brilliant. We now know what we could not have known as children. It all was a gift. Each of us rose above our circumstances. We came of age at a time when kids swam without any concerns in the irrigation canals. We rode our bikes and rode horses without helmets, and almost nobody's car had a seatbelt in it. When we worked the strawberry fields, we'd just brush the dirt off the strawberries and eat them right from the field. Kids might be a lot safer these days, but I'm not so sure they're as hardy. Her gift was only part of what made us so hardy, while she made sure we were always properly nourished. It might have been that we ingested some things that probably inoculated us for life that she knew nothing of, especially we big kids. Our dad would put salt blocks out for the cattle to lick, and Twist Tom and I weren't the least bit put off by the fact that the cows had licked them before we did. The best parts of the salt block was always the dried foamy chunks resulting from the cow's saliva. We could just carry those around in our pockets and enjoy them as we wished. We had turned the old woodshed in Canada into a makeshift kitchen for when we played house. As the mother, I would rescue old used ketchup and mustard bottles and add a little water to the remnants, so that when I made mud pies, we would have ketchup and mustard, what we called hamburgers. The mustard and ketchup concoctions would sometimes last all summer. It might have been to our advantage that neither of us could ever eat more than even half of a mud pie hamburger, no matter how much ketchup we poured on it. Our mother was not without her own means for ensuring the strength of our immune systems, and one of them became iconic for us. Our mother was a big fan of Miracle Whip, and there was always a jar of it sitting on the kitchen counter. It didn't matter that a lot of the time no one knew where the lid was. Wouldn't have mattered anyway, because there was a knife sticking out most of the time. Both the knife and the edge of the jar would sometimes get a little green around the edges. Most of my siblings have been a little timid about using this method on our own children, even though it seemed to work for us. We do sometimes expose them to that ethereal box of crayons our mother inadvertently left